The pod fell through the sky like a dying star. It came down silent and burning, trailing white smoke across the clouds of New Breton, a quiet farming colony on the edge of human space. It hit the ground at the far end of a wheat field with a sound like thunder cracking open the earth. The wheat bent flat in every direction. Dirt flew upward, and then there was silence again, broken only by the wind moving through the golden stalks. Dan Weber heard the crash from his kitchen. He was making dinner. Just soup. Nothing special. He had been making soup for one person for 3 years now, ever since his wife passed. He lived alone on a 60-acre homestead with a lazy hound dog named Biscuit and more silence than any man needed. When the ground shook and the windows rattled, Biscuit lifted his head from the floor, looked at Dan, and put his head back down. Dan grabbed his coat and a flashlight and walked out into the evening air. The sun was low and orange. He followed the smoke trail across his property until he found a crater. In the center of it sat a metal pod about the size of a bathtub, cracked open along one side. It was not human-made. The markings on it were sharp and angular, cut into dark silver metal. Dan had hauled cargo between colonies for 20 years before he retired. He had seen alien ships. He had never seen anything like this. He knelt beside the pod and looked inside. There was a child. It was small, maybe 3 years old by human measure. Its skin was covered in pale, almost white scales that caught the fading light. It had 2 arms, 2 legs, a thin tail curled around its own body, and a ridge of flat fins running from the top of its head down the back of its neck. A crest. It was dull and gray. The child was not moving. Its mouth hung open and its eyes were shut. They could see its ribs through its skin. It had not been fed in a long time. He reached in carefully and touched the child's chest. Cold, but there was a heartbeat, faint and fast like a small drum. Dan did not call the authorities. He did not contact the colonial office. He picked the child up, wrapped it in his coat, and carried it back to the house. Inside, he laid the child on the couch near the wood stove and covered it with a blanket. Biscuit walked over and sniffed the child's face, then lay down beside the couch like a guard. Dan warmed up his soup. He did not know what this child ate. He did not know where it came from. He did not know why it was in a metal box falling from the sky. But the child was cold and thin and alone, and Dan had soup, and that was enough for now. The child woke up 2 hours later. It sat up so fast it nearly fell off the couch. Its eyes were wide and bright yellow, with vertical slits for pupils. It looked around the room in wild terror. When it saw Dan sitting at the kitchen table, it opened its mouth and hissed. The sound was sharp and high and full of fear. Its small claws gripped the blanket so hard the fabric tore. Dan did not move. He did not stand. He did not reach out. He just sat there at the table with a bowl of soup in front of him and said, "Hey, little one, you are safe. Nobody is going to hurt you." The child did not understand the words, but something in the tone made it stop hissing. It stayed pressed against the back of the couch, shaking, watching Dan with those golden eyes. Dan slowly pushed a second bowl of soup to the edge of the table. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked away, giving the child space. An hour passed. Then 2. Dan read a book. Biscuit snored on the floor. The fire crackled in the stove. The child did not move from the couch, but it stopped shaking. Its eyes followed Dan everywhere, waiting for something, waiting for a punishment that never came. Somewhere around midnight, Dan heard a small sound. He looked up. The child had climbed off the couch and was standing beside the table, barely tall enough to see over it. Its thin hand reached for the bowl of soup. It looked at Dan. "Done no det." The child picked up the bowl with both hands and drank from it in quick, desperate gulps. Soup ran down its chin and onto the floor. Biscuit licked it up. When the bowl was empty, the child set it down and stood very still, staring at Dan. Then it did something Dan had not expected. It walked around the table, climbed into the chair beside him, and sat there, not touching him, just sitting close, choosing to be near instead of far. Dan looked at the child. The child looked at him. Its crest was still dull and gray. Its ribs still showed through its scales. But its eyes were steady now, still afraid but steady. "All right," Dan said quietly. "I guess you're staying." He carried the child to bed that night. He did not have a child's room, so he put it in his bed and slept in the chair beside it. The child curled into a tight ball with its tail wrapped around itself. Dan watched it sleep and thought about the pod in his field. Someone had put this child in a box and dropped it from the sky. Someone had thrown it away. He decided to call the child Soul, after the sun, because the boy flinched at every shadow, and Dan figured he could use a name that meant light. Outside, the wheat field swayed under a sky full of stars. Somewhere far above, the Ruvari Empire turned its attention to more important matters and forgot about Unit 4 of Clutch 12. They had discarded him according to protocol. The file was closed. The defect had been removed. They did not know a man named Dan Weber had picked him up out of the dirt and carried him home. Soul would not eat unless Dan ate first. Every single meal, every single time, Dan would put food on the table, sit down, and Soul would stand perfectly still beside his chair with his hands flat against his sides, eyes on the floor. He would not move. He would not reach for anything. He would wait until Dan had taken the first bite, and only then would he carefully, silently begin eating. If Dan tried to let Soul eat first, the child would freeze completely, as if something terrible was about to happen. The tea took Dan 2 weeks to understand. This was not shyness. This was training. Somewhere before that pod landed in his wheat field, someone had taught this child that he must never eat before a higher-ranking being. That food was earned through obedience. That hunger was the default, and a full stomach was a reward. Dan hated it. But he did not push. He just kept eating first, kept putting the food out, and kept making sure Soul's plate was always a little fuller than his own. The first month was the hardest. Soul did not speak. Not in his own language. Not in any language. He moved through the house like a ghost, silent and careful, always watching Dan from the corners of rooms. He slept curled in a tight ball at the very edge of the bed, his tail wrapped around himself, taking up as little space as possible. If Dan coughed in the night, Soul would wake instantly and sit up, rigid, waiting. He flinched at everything. Loud sounds, sudden movements, the clatter of a plate being set down too hard. Once, Dan reached up quickly to grab a mug from a high shelf, and Soul dropped to the floor, flat on his stomach, his hands over his head. He stayed there until Dan knelt beside him and said, very quietly, "I was just getting a cup, buddy. That is all." Soul's yellow eyes looked up at him, searching for the lie. He did not find one, but it still took him 10 minutes to stand back up. Biscuit became the bridge. The old hound dog had no sense of personal space and no understanding of trauma. He would walk up to Soul and push his big, warm head into the child's lap without warning. The first time it happened, Soul went stiff as a board. The second time, he tolerated it. The third time, his small clawed hand slowly reached down and rested on Biscuit's ear. By the end of the second week, Soul would sit on the floor beside Biscuit and lean against his side while Dan cooked dinner. It was the closest thing to relaxation the child had shown. Dan started teaching him words. Simple ones. He would point at things and say their names. Cup, door, window, tree, solistend. He absorbed. He did not repeat them at first, just filed them away behind those bright yellow eyes. Then one evening, Dan pointed at Biscuit and said dog. Soul looked at Biscuit. Then he looked at Dan, and in a small, careful voice, he said dog. It was the first word he spoke in Dan's language. Dan smiled so wide his face hurt. After that, words came slowly but steadily. Water, food, outside, cold. Soul learned them like tools, using each one only when necessary, never wasting a syllable. Dan noticed that the boy never asked for anything. He would say cold, only when he was shivering badly enough that it could not be hidden. He would say food, only when Dan had forgotten to prepare a meal and Soul's stomach was making sounds loud enough to hear across the room. He had been taught that needs were weaknesses and weaknesses were punished at. This Dan began to teach him something else. He started asking Soul what he wanted, not what he needed, what he wanted. Do you want to go outside? Do you want to sit on the porch? Do you want more soup? At first, Soul did not understand the question. One was not a concept that had existed in his world. But Dan kept asking, every day, patiently, without pressure point. One morning in the third month, Dan made 2 kinds of breakfast, eggs and toast on one plate, porridge with fruit on another. He set both on the table and said, Pick whichever one you want, Soul. The child stood there for a long time, looking between the two plates. His crest, still dull gray, twitched slightly. His hand hovered over the porridge. He looked at Dan, waiting for correction. Dan just nodded. Soul took the porridge. He ate the entire bowl, and when he finished, his crest flickered. Just for a moment, a faint pulse of pale gold light, like a candle trying to stay lit in the wind. Then it went gray again, but Dan had seen it, and he understood that whatever that crest was, whatever it meant in Soul's biology, it responded to something inside the boy, something that had been locked away and was now, very slowly, finding its way to the surface. The word came by accident. It was a Tuesday evening. Dan was fixing a broken fence post out front, and Soul was sitting on the porch steps watching him. Dan hit his thumb with a hammer and yelped. Soul jumped to his feet, alarmed. Dan laughed and held up his thumb. I'm fine, bud. Just clumsy. So relaxed. Dan went back to hammering. A few minutes later, Soul said something so quietly it almost disappeared into the wind. Dad. Dan stopped. The hammer hung still in his hand. He turned around slowly. Soul was standing on the bottom step, frozen. His eyes were wide and filled with something close to terror. His mouth was slightly open, as if he wanted to take the word back. As if he had broken a rule so deep he did not even know it existed until he crossed it. Dan set the hammer down. He walked to the steps and knelt in front of Soul so their eyes were level. The boy was trembling. Yeah, bud, Dan said. That is me. Sol es up. Not a flicker this time. A glow. Faint, unsteady, pale gold spreading across the ridge of fins from the top of his head to the back of his neck. It lasted only a few seconds before it faded. But it was real. And when Soul's small hand reached out and gripped Dan's shirt, holding on like the man might disappear, Dan put his arms around the boy and held him right there on the porch steps while the sun went down behind the wheat. He did not let go until Soul did. BBY Greenfield was 17 years old, lived on the next farm over, and had been helping Dan with chores since before his wife passed. She was loud, stubborn, and afraid of absolutely nothing, which made her the worst possible person to introduce to a traumatized alien child, and also somehow the best. The first time she saw Soul, he was hiding behind Dan's legs in the kitchen doorway. She crouched down, looked at him, and said, Cool. You have a tail. Can you hang from stuff with it? Soul stared at her. Abby grinned. We'll find out later. That was the beginning of their friendship. Abby came by 3 times a week to help with the farm, and slowly, carefully, Soul began to orbit around her the way he orbited around Dan. She was different from Dan, though. Dan was quiet and steady. Abby was energy and noise and motion. She talked to Soul constantly, even when he did not answer. She narrated everything she did. Now I'm feeding the chickens, Soul. This one is named Potato because she's shaped like one. And that one is General Fluffy because she thinks she is in charge. Soul would watch her from a distance, his yellow eyes tracking her every movement. And sometimes the faintest ghost of a smile would cross his face. That'd be why the time Soul was the human equivalent of 7 years old. Dan made the decision to enroll him in the colony school. It was not easy. There was paperwork. There were questions. The colonial administrator, a woman named Mrs. Hadley, sat across from Dan and said, He is not a registered citizen. Dan said, He is my son. Mrs. Hadley looked at the pale-scaled child sitting quietly in the chair beside Dan, holding a stuffed rabbit that Abby had given him, and decided not to argue. School was a new world. Soul had learned enough human language by now to speak in short, careful sentences. He could read at a basic level. He understood math better than most kids his age because the Ruvari creche had drilled numbers into him before he could walk. But the social part was something no amount of preparation could have taught him. There were 22 children in the colony school. Most of them had never seen an alien up close. Some were curious. A girl named Lily asked Soul if he could change colors. A boy named Paul asked if his tail was like a lizard's tail and whether it would grow back if it fell off. Soul answered every question seriously and honestly, which made some of the children laugh and others decide that he was strange but acceptable. Then there was Ricky. Ricky Dawes was 9, a year older than most of the class, and he had decided on the very first day that Soul was a target. He called Soul Lizard in the hallway. He knocked Soul's books off his desk. He told other kids not to sit with Soul at lunch because you might catch whatever is wrong with him. Soul endured it. He endured it the way the creche had trained him to endure everything. Head down, hands flat, eyes on the floor. Do not react. Do not speak. Lower beings accept their place. Dan noticed the change at home. Soul stopped talking about school. He stopped eating as much. His crest, which had been showing more and more gold over the past year, went gray again. Dan asked what was wrong. Soul said nothing. It was the first time he had ever lied to Dan, and they both knew IT was Abby who got the truth out of him. She sat on the porch with Soul one afternoon and said, "Something is eating at you, little guy. I can tell because Biscuit can tell, and Biscuit only gets worried when things are actually bad." Soul looked at the dog, who was indeed sitting unusually close to him, his big brown eyes fixed on the boy's face. And slowly, quietly, Soul told Abby about Ricky. Abby did not go to the school. She did not tell Dan, at least not right away. Instead, she sat with Soul and said something that no one in his entire life had ever said to him. "You do not have to just take it, Soul. You do not hit first. That is important, but you do not have to stand there and let someone treat you like you're nothing. You are allowed to speak up. You are allowed to say stop." Soul looked at her like she had told him gravity was optional. "I am allowed," he whispered. "Yes," Abby said. "You are." It happened 3 days later. Ricky cornered Soul behind the school building during lunch break. He grabbed Soul's stuffed rabbit and held it above his head. "Want your baby toy, Lizard? Jump for it." 2 other boys stood nearby, laughing. Soul stood very still. His hands were shaking. Every piece of his old training screamed at him to submit, to lower his eyes, to endure. But somewhere beneath all of that, a new voice spoke. Abby's voice. Dan's voice. The voice of a home where he was allowed to want things, allowed to choose, allowed to exist. Soul looked up at Ricky. His voice trembled, but it did not break. "Give it back," he said. "And stop." Ricky laughed. He shoved Soul hard with one hand. Soul stumbled backward, but did not fall. And then something happened that Soul did not expect and could not control. His crest flared. It lit up in a blaze of bright, burning gold that spread from the top of his head down his neck like a crown of fire. It was a Ruvari threat display, an ancient biological response meant to warn predators that the creature before them was not prey. Soul had not known he could do it. He had never felt safe enough for his body to think he was worth defending. Ricky dropped the rabbit. He took 3 steps back, his face white, and then he ran. The other 2 boys followed. Soul stood alone behind the school building, his crest fading slowly, his hands still shaking, the rabbit on the ground at his feet. The school called Dan. He drove over, listened to the full story from the teacher, and looked at Soul sitting in a chair in the hallway, expecting punishment. Dan knelt beside him and said, "You did good, bud." Then he took Soul to the general store and bought him the biggest ice cream they had out on the drive home. Soul's crest glowed faintly, a soft warm gold that matched the afternoon light. He ate his ice cream in the passenger seat and said nothing. But when they pulled into the driveway, he looked at Dan and said, "Dad, Abby told me I was allowed to say stop." She was right. Dan said 12,000 light years away. A Ruvari patrol vessel passed through the sector on routine business. Its sensors flagged a faint biosignature on the colony world of New Britain. Imperial Ruvari DNA. The officer on duty noted it in the system. The report traveled upward through the chain. It reached the Imperial Court 6 days later. A clerk read it, cross-referenced the genetic tag, and found a match. Unit 4 of Clutch 12. Status: terminated. Disposition: released on Barren World. Designation: 774. The clerk frowned. New Britain was not a barren world. New Britain was a human colony. The clerk flagged the file and sent it to the first assessor's office. 3 ships dropped out of light speed above New Britain on a Wednesday afternoon. They were Ruvari. Sleek, angular, silver-hulled vessels that moved through space the way blades move through water. They did not contact the colonial government. They did not request permission to land. They set down on the public landing field outside the town of Miller's Crossing, 2 miles from Dan Weber's farm, and sent a formal notice to the colonial administrator's office that read, "The Ruvari Empire is conducting a retrieval of imperial biological property. Cooperation is expected. Interference will be noted." Mrs. Hadley, the same administrator who had enrolled Sol in school, read the notice twice, then picked up her communicator and called Dan. Dan was in the barn when the call came. Sol was sitting on a hay bale nearby, reading a book about birds that Abby had given him. His crest glowed with a soft, steady gold as he turned the pages. He had been doing well. His nightmares were less frequent. He laughed sometimes now. He had friends at school. 2 girls named Lily and Grace who did not care about his scales, and a boy named Paul who thought his tail was amazing. Sol was not healed. He might never be completely healed, but he was growing, and the gray was leaving his crest a little more each day. Dan listened to Mrs. Hadley. He hung up. He looked at Sol on the hay bale. The boy looked up from his book and saw something in Dan's face that he had not seen before. Not anger, not fear, something harder than both. "Dad," Sol said, "stay close to me today, bud," Dan said. They came to the farm that evening. 3 Ruvari officials walking in a precise line up the dirt path toward the house. They were tall, nearly 7 feet, with polished silver scales and ceremonial armor that caught the last light of the sun. Their crests were rigid and colorless, held in a permanent neutral display. They moved without sound. Behind them, 2 armed escorts stood at the edge of the property. The one in front was First Assessor Dren. He had a long face, narrow eyes the color of cold steel, and a voice that sounded like it had never been raised in emotion. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Dan, who was standing in front of the door with his arms crossed. Sol was behind him, pressed against his back, one hand gripping the fabric of Dan's shirt. "You're Daniel Weber," Dren said. It was not a question. "I am. You are in possession of Ruvari biological material. Specifically, Unit 4 of Clutch 12, discarded under Imperial Purity Directive 917. The unit was scheduled for environmental release on a barren world. Due to a navigational error, the release occurred on this planet instead. We are here to correct that error and retrieve the unit." Dan did not move. "His name is Sol." Dren blinked slowly. "The unit does not have a name. It has a classification number." "He has a name," Dan said. "I gave it to him. His name is Sol. He is my son." There was a pause. Dren looked at the other 2 officials. They showed no expression. Dren turned back to Dan. "I do not understand. The unit is genetically defective. Its crest development is abnormal. Under Ruvari biological law, it has no status, no rights, and no value. It is waste material. Why would you claim ownership of it?" "Because he is not waste material. He is a child." Dren tilted his head. The gesture was not curiosity. It was the Ruvari equivalent of confusion bordering on disgust. Human sentimentality is documented in our cultural files. It is considered a weakness of your species. This unit was discarded according to proper protocol. Its continued existence is an administrative irregularity. We are here to resolve that irregularity. Dan felt Sol's grip tighten on his shirt. He could feel the boy trembling. He put his hand behind his back and rested it on Sol's head. The child pressed into his palm. "What does resolve mean?" Dan asked, though he already knew the answer. "The unit will be returned to Imperial custody for reassessment and appropriate disposition." Disposition d'un repos. Termination. Dren clarified, as if the word held no more weight than any other. The unit should not exist. Its survival was not intended. We are simply completing a process that was interrupted by mechanical failure. Dan looked at Dren. He looked at the 2 officials behind him. He looked at the armed escorts standing at the edge of his property. And then he spoke in the same quiet, steady voice he used when he told Sol bedtime stories. "You threw him away. You put him in a metal box and dropped him from the sky onto a planet to die alone. He was 3 years old. He was starving. He was so scared he could not stop shaking for a week. I found him in my wheat field. I fed him. I kept him warm. I taught him words. I held him when he cried. I sat with him through nightmares. I watched him learn to smile. I heard him call me dad for the first time, and it was the best thing I have heard in my entire life." Dan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "He is my son. You will not take him. Dren stared at Dan for a long time. The Ruvari's steel-colored eyes moved from Dan's face to the small figure behind him. Sol was peeking out from behind Dan's arm. His crest was flickering between gray and gold. Fear and something else fighting for control. His yellow eyes met Dren's. Dren saw it. The crest. Responding. Active. In a defective unit that should have been dead years ago. His expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A question he did not ask out loud. This matter is not concluded, Dren said. The Empire does not abandon its claims. We will pursue this through the Galactic Compact. Biological property cannot be appropriated by outside species. He turned. The three officials walked back down the path in the same precise line. The escorts followed. They returned to their ships. Dan stood on the porch until the sound of their engines faded into the evening sky. Then he felt Sol's arms wrap around his waist from behind, squeezing tight. The boy's face pressed into Dan's back. "They want to take me away," Sol whispered. Dan turned around and knelt. He put both hands on Sol's shoulders and looked into those bright yellow eyes. "Nobody is taking you anywhere. You hear me? Nobody." Sol's krast burnadgo. Steady and strong. He nodded. Inside the house, Biscuit was barking at the window where the Ruvari ships had been. Dan closed the door, locked it, and for the first time in his life, wished he still had a gun. The hearing was held in the only building in Miller's Crossing large enough to host a Galactic Compact arbitration panel. The town hall, which on most days served as a community center where people held bake sales and square dances. They pushed the folding tables against the walls, set up a long bench at the front for the three arbitrators, and ran a temporary translation feed for the Ruvari delegation. The whole thing looked like a courtroom built by people who had never seen a courtroom but were doing their best. Dan wore his only good shirt. Sol sat beside him in a chair that was too big, his feet dangling above the floor. He was wearing a jacket that Abby had bought him for the occasion. His crest was dim, held low and tight against his head. He had not spoken all morning. First Assessor Dren sat on the opposite side of the room with two Ruvari legal advisors. They wore the same polished armor. They carried data pads filled with imperial statutes and biological classification codes. They looked at the town hall the way a surgeon might look at a shed being used as an operating room. The arbitration panel consisted of three members appointed by the Galactic Compact: a human woman from the Judicial Corps, a tall insectoid Pelari mediator, and a Finn elder whose species was known for writing half the interstellar treaties in the current era. They were neutral. They were here to settle a claim. Dan could not afford a lawyer. Xenocustody law was a specialty that barely existed on a farming colony. But 3 days after the Ruvari filed their claim, a man named Judge Howard Parsons knocked on Dan's door. He was 74 years old, retired, and had spent 30 years in colonial courts before moving to New Breton to grow tomatoes. He told Dan, "I saw the filing. I am not letting that stand." He took the case for nothing. The Ruvari presented their argument first. Dren stood and spoke without emotion. Unit 4 of Clutch 12 was conceived from imperial genetic stock. It was the biological product of the Ruvari ruling line. Under imperial biological sovereignty, all genetic offspring of the ruling class remained the property of the Empire regardless of location, condition, or the passage of time. The unit was discarded lawfully under the Purity Directive. Its survival was an accident. Its presence on a human colony was unauthorized. The Empire was exercising its legal right to retrieve its property. Dren presented genetic records. Transport logs. The original discard order signed and stamped by 3 Imperial officials. He called Sol the unit 14 times in 20 minutes. He never once looked at the child. Judge Parsons stood next. He was shorter than Dren by nearly 2 feet. He wore a wrinkled jacket and reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. He did not have genetic records or imperial stamps. He had something else he called Mrs. Hadley first. She testified that Sol had been enrolled in the colony school for over 3 years, that he attended every day, that he had friends, that he participated in class, helped younger students with math, and had won second place in the school science fair with a project about soil composition on New Breton. He called Dr. Nora Webb, the colony physician. She testified that when Sol was first brought to her, He weighed less than half what a Ruvari child his age should weigh. He had untreated fractures in two of his ribs that had healed incorrectly. He showed signs of prolonged malnutrition and severe psychological trauma consistent with institutionalized neglect. She submitted 3 years of medical records showing his recovery under Dan's care. Weight gain, bone density improvement, reduced stress indicators. She said, in plain language, that child was dying when Dan found him. He is alive because Dan chose to save him. He called Abby, who testified that Sol could name every chicken on the farm, that his favorite food was porridge with fruit, and that he slept with a stuffed rabbit named Captain Floppy. The Palari mediator made a small sound that the translation feed could not interpret. Then Judge Parsons turned to Dren and asked one question. First Assessor, you have stated that this child is valuable property of the Ruvari Empire. You have invoked biological sovereignty. You have cited ownership over his genetic material. My question is simple. He paused. If this child is so valuable to your empire, why was he sealed in a pod and dropped onto a planet to starve to death alone? The room was silent. Dren opened his mouth. No sound came out. He looked at his legal advisors. They looked at their data pads. No statute in the Ruvari legal code contained an answer to that question, because the question attacked the one thing the code never examined: the contradiction between claiming ownership and choosing disposal. Dren finally said, the directive was lawful. That was not my question, Judge Parsons said. Dren did not answer again. The panel deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the Finn elder spoke. The compact recognized biological claims only where ongoing care, custody, and responsibility could be demonstrated. The Ruvari Empire had not provided care. It had not maintained custody. It had deliberately terminated its responsibility. A discarded being, regardless of species, could not be reclaimed as property once another party had assumed guardianship and demonstrated sustained care. Sol was granted protected residency under human guardianship, with Daniel Weber recognized as his legal father under compact family law. The room erupted. Not loudly. This was a farming town. People clapped. Mrs. Hadley wiped her eyes. Abby grabbed Sol and lifted him off his chair and held him so tight his tail wrapped around her arm. Dr. Webb shook Dan's hand. Judge Parsons sat down heavily and took off his glasses and cleaned them for a very long time. Dan looked across the room. Dren was standing. The Ruvari officials gathered their data pads. Dren met Dan's eyes for a single moment. There was no anger in his expression. There was something worse. Confusion. Genuine, unprocessed confusion. He could not understand why this human wanted a broken thing. The Ruvari left New Breton that evening. Their ships rose silently into the darkening sky and disappeared on the drive home. Sol sat in the passenger seat, holding Captain Floppy. His crest burned steady gold. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, Dad, am I really allowed to stay? Dan reached over and put his hand on Sol's head. You're home, bud. That is not something anyone gets to take away. 14 years is not a long time in the life of a galaxy. Stars do not notice it. Empires barely feel it. But on a wheat farm on the edge of human space, 14 years changed everything. The field where the pod had crashed was smooth again. The wheat grew tall and golden over the scar in the earth, as if nothing had ever fallen there. Biscuit was buried under the oak tree beside the barn, where the shade was best in the summer. A new dog, a scruffy brown mutt named Gravy, slept in the same spot on the kitchen floor. Dan Weber was 61 now. His hair was gray. His knees gave him trouble on cold mornings. He moved slower than he used to, and he forgot things sometimes. Small things like where he left his glasses or whether he had already fed the chickens. But he still made soup every evening. He still sat on the porch at sunset. And he still called Sol Bud. Even though Sol was now taller than he was, Sol had grown into something the Ruvari Empire would not have recognized. He stood just over 6 feet, lean and strong, with scales that had deepened from pale white to a warm silver gray that caught the light like polished stone. His tail was long and balanced, and he used it without thinking, wrapping it around fence posts when he leaned on them, flicking it when he was amused. His eyes were still bright yellow, still sharp, still watching everything. But the fear was gone from them. It had been gone for years, and his crest. His crest glowed a permanent, warm gold. Not flickering, not fading. Steady, like a lantern that never went out. Ruvari biologists, if they had seen it, would have called it impossible. A defective crest was defective for life. It did not repair. It did not develop. That was settled science. But Ruvari science had never accounted for what a human father and a lazy dog and a loud teenage girl and a town full of stubborn farmers could do to a child who had been told he was nothing. Sol had been accepted into the New Breton Agricultural Institute. He was the first Ruvari to ever attend a human university. The acceptance letter sat on the kitchen table for 3 days because Dan kept picking it up and reading it again, shaking his head and smiling. Abby, who was now 31 and ran her family's farm on her own, came over with a cake that said, "Congratulations, Sol," in slightly crooked letters. She told Sol that if he did not call her every week from school, she would drive there and embarrass him in front of his classmates. Sol believed her completely. The story had spread. Not because anyone planned it. A reporter from a colonial news network had covered the arbitration hearing years ago. The piece was small. It ran once and was forgotten. But somehow, the way things do on the galactic networks, it resurfaced. Someone shared it, then someone else. Then it traveled beyond human space entirely. A Pelari academic wrote a paper about it. A Finn cultural archive included it in a collection about interspecies guardianship. A small, quiet revolution of attention built around the story of a discarded alien prince and a human farmer who raised him. Other species began asking questions. Not loudly, not officially, but in academic halls, in diplomatic back channels, in the whispered conversations of young people on a dozen different worlds. What did the humans do differently? How did they take a broken child and make him whole? What technology did they use? What program? What method? The answer unsettled them. There was no technology. There was no program. A man found a cold, starving child in a field. He carried him inside. He fed him soup. He gave him a name. He let him be afraid without punishing him for it. He let him be slow without rushing him. He let him be small without making him feel lesser. He called him son. That was it. That was the whole method that on the Ruvari throne world. The emperor sat in a chamber of black glass and read a cultural intelligence report prepared by his advisors. It contained a detailed analysis of the human colony of New Breton. It contained the medical records showing that a defective unit, genetically classified as waste, had developed a fully functional crest under human care. It contained images of Sol standing in a wheat field with the sun behind him, his crest blazing gold, smiling. The emperor read the report slowly. Then he ordered the file deleted and the analyst reassigned. The matter was closed, but it was not closed. In the lower levels of the throne world, in the creches where the next generation of Ruvari were being raised under the same cold protocols that had shaped Sol, the story circulated, passed from child to child in fragments. A prince who was thrown away, a human who picked him up, a crest that was supposed to stay dark but burned gold instead. The youngest Ruvari did not have words for what the story made them feel. They only knew that it made them wonder. And wondering, in an empire built on certainty, was the most dangerous thing of all. Sol came home to the farm one evening near the end of summer. He had been in town buying supplies for his first semester. He found Dan on the porch, sitting in his old chair, watching the sun go down over the wheat. Gravy was asleep at his feet. The sky was orange and pink, and the air smelled like warm earth and grain. Sol sat down in the chair beside him. His crest glowed softly in the fading light. They sat together in silence for a while, the way they had sat together 1,000 times before. Father and son, human and Ruvari. Two people who should never have found each other, sitting on a porch at the edge of the galaxy, watching the day end. Dad, Sol said. Yeah, boo. Thank you for picking me up. Dan looked at him, the boy who had been a shaking, starving, gray-crested ghost in a metal pod. The young man who sat beside him now, golden and steady and real. Dan smiled the way he always smiled, slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. You were right there in my field, kid. What was I going to do, leave you? He could not have. No human could have. That was the thing the Ruvari Empire, with all its genetic codes and purity directives, could not compute. That was the thing the galaxy, with all its ancient civilizations and advanced species, kept stumbling over when they studied humanity. Humans did not love because it was efficient. They did not care because it served a purpose. They found broken things and held them until the broken things remembered they were whole, that it was not logical. It was not strategic. It could not be measured or classified or filed. And that the galaxy was slowly learning was the most terrifying and beautiful thing about them.